getting a diagnosis and getting help, I think is really key. I know some parents worry about putting a label on their child, and there's going to be a burden for them. But actually, with a diagnosis comes understanding and support groups, and you can then really start to advocate properly for your child in school, and to step back and work out really whether they are they have the right level of support.
My diagnosis journey began after much deliberating, should I, shouldn't I. Eventually I had, in those 5 years, compiled a big folder full of evidence, you know, because I kind of knew somehow this wasn't going to be, and it shouldn't be easy, and you don't just go to the doctor and say, oh, you know, give us a diagnosis. Of course you don't.
So for us, our son was always a very happy, very quirky child, very happy in school, relatively high achiever. And then really the issue started to develop when he was around 9 or 10, and became quite clear as he was growing up, he was developing in a slightly different way to his peers, and started to find school more challenging, and his anxiety was starting to increase as a result of that. And then that's where really our journey into the world of autism started.
My wife and I realised that something wasn't quite right, and me being a teacher and her being in sort of medicine, you know, it was fairly easy to spot when he was 4 that he was on the spectrum.
If I really think back, I had complications in my pregnancy at 20 weeks, and the scan was the demonstrated sort of ventriculomegaly, which we were told not to Google, so we didn't Google, but my husband Googled, and actually there is a link between ventriculomegaly and autism. However, didn't really get pregnancy progressed, largely without too many complications, but I knew, I think in my heart, something wasn't quite right. Everything was a challenge. He wouldn't settle, he was complicated, he was restless.
So before we got the diagnosis, we were having a lot of different appointments with different specialists, and it was actually when Ben got into school that we started to get access to that help. So when he was at reception age in mainstream, that's when we started to get the specialists involved. I remember at the time saying to my wife that, you know, you deal with all the appointments and the assessment, and I don't want you to worry about work and the bills and everything else, you know, I'll cover that. And I think as a dad, I kind of took that kind of practical approach to it, that we're just going to go through this process and see what happens. And I remember this one day turning up to this big appointment, and there were all these specialists in the room. There was a child psychiatrist, there was somebody from speech and language. And I remember sitting there, and it was the first time that I'd been to one of these appointments. And when I started to hear them talk about Ben and all these different characteristics and challenges and difficulties, I just started to get emotional. And it was the first time that I realised that what my wife had been going through, that there was an emotional side to this. And I was just looking from a practical side that, you know, we need to get this diagnosis.
So our son, he was diagnosed at 6, and actually it came down to my mum, who, she's retired now, but she was a teacher for her whole life. And when our son was 2 or 3 at nursery, she said to us, there's something wrong with Adam. And as parents, you're kind of like, I don't want to hear those words. What do you mean there's something wrong with Adam? The diagnosis itself, the process, really helped us as parents understand him much better.
For us, it was almost a relief, because we'd known that there was something, and doing the walk of shame every day after school, to teachers say, you know, your son's been in trouble again today, he's been a bit disruptive. At least we had an explanation, perhaps, of what had been seen.
So the specialist gave us a scan, and he said, if this scan shows any red elements on the brain, it means your son is on the spectrum, and we can diagnose depending on where that red part is. And when he unveiled this brain scan, the entire brain was red. And so it was very obvious that my son was on the autistic spectrum.
And I remember the doctor's appointment when we had the assessment, and she was doing different tests, and she kept looking at me and looking away and looking at me. It was making me feel more nervous. And then she came out with, your son is diagnosed with autism. He has the typical characteristics, and that, he's got development delay and this complex learning difficulty. And I remember at the time, it was really hard to hear that for the first time. I kind of knew and suspected that he was on the spectrum. But the first time you actually hear the diagnosis, it really hit me. And it was a sense of relief in one part that we got this diagnosis. And that would enable us then to get the right help and the right support that he needed. But at the same time, all this fear and anxiety started to hit me, and I didn't really know what that meant. What does that mean for Ben? What does that mean for now? What does that mean as he grows and develops and moves as an adult? And, there's no kind of manual for, this is what autism means. This is what's going to happen at this stage of life, and as they progress, this is where you go for all the help and the guidance.
I have what is now known as autism spectrum disorder. I was diagnosed when I was around, I believe, 10. Quite difficult for me to understand when I was younger what it meant. But as I got older, I came to accept it, and I realised that it doesn't mean anything to me. It's just a name that people say, but people look at you differently for having it.
My diagnosis started when I was, in year 6, got diagnosed with dyslexia. And then that kind of evolved. There were still things that I wasn't quite doing. And then when I was 13 years old, I got a diagnosis that I was ADHD and started on that journey. And it really did change my life. It changed how I was able to operate in the classroom, it changed how I was able to revise for exams. I wasn't, it explained a lot of my behaviours while I was a bit naughty, whatever. So yeah, it was a big step in me kind of growing as a teenager and a man, but for me, it's kind of my defining characteristic of how I operate today, the way I want to interact with the world, the way I think about things, the way I look at problems. For me, it's part of my identity.
So I went for the assessment. It was quite stressful. They had spoken to my mum, who I believe had ADHD herself, and she couldn't really remember a lot of the stuff. So basically, the report said, as a child, Suzi lined up all of her teddies every night before bed, and if one of them fell over or was out of place, she would have to start the whole process again. So in one, that's quite stereotypically autistic. In another sentence, it said Suzi was invited to birthday parties, and she had birthday parties herself. So they were saying, if you're autistic, you don't get invited to birthday parties, okay? So I was reading it the other day. It was quite annoying, really.
Special needs to me and to my son when he had his diagnosis, and he was encouraged to visit the SEN coordinator, and he said, SEN, what's that? Special education needs. So it was quite insulting. It's like he was top of his class academically. What's special needs about me? So I think that can be misleading. And again, you're labelling someone who, in reality, is not that different to anyone else, but just has a different way of processing information and of learning.
I think the whole journey of trying to get the support that you need for your child, regardless of what their needs are, is incredibly challenging. You have to learn this whole new skill set that you didn't even know you needed. Thankfully, I had worked with adults with autism and sensory processing needs, and so kind of had an idea of how to play the system, I guess. But actually, when it's your own child and you're being accused of being a bad parent, you're not sticking to kind of the guidance around parenting, you're not being firm enough, your child isn't able to access school because they can't support him in school, you kind of start to lose a little bit of self-belief.
And I think, if I'm honest, just for that moment, it just took away the joy of being a dad, just being a parent, because all I saw was just this beautiful little toddler that I was having a whale of a time with. And all of a sudden now I'm looking at Ben and it's all about autism. And I think that's something that can stay with you quite a while through the whole experience, where you focus too much on the diagnosis and the label, and you need these labels because that's what enables you to get the right help and support. But it can take away just that joy of just being a parent and just enjoying your child for who they are.
I thought it would change my life because I didn't understand. I thought of like people that have like Down syndrome. I was like one of them. It wasn't really explained to me well. It was just said you have now autism. So I thought that I was going to be in a home, that I won't be able to do anything for myself. But luckily I had my mum. She was probably one of the best role models I've had. She helped me through it all and just kept me going and said that you're not different. She treated me like anybody should be treated, like a normal person.
And it was only when I got my psychologist reports and kind of look at all the charts that say where your strengths are and where your challenges are, and you have what's called kind of a spiky profile, in that you tend to have some things that you're really, really good at and some things that you're kind of way below average at. And that's where people kind of talk about the superpowers and the challenges of it. And it was only seeing that profile that I kind of thought, oh, that's kind of not how it is for other people. And it was hard, particularly being in your 40s. You know, you've got an established life, you've got an established career, you've got a family, and it feels like suddenly you have to reassess who you are, and that's taken quite a few years, and I'd say I'm kind of just almost coming out the other side of it, if that makes sense. It's kind of like a new journey that you go on from having thought you knew who you were and then thinking, oh, actually, that wasn't me, that was the me who was just masking all the time to kind of fit in.
So let me chat a little bit about my son's diagnosis and how that has been for our family. Every day is a learning day, because each day, and as my son gets older, it changes, as you would expect with a teenager. So the diagnosis just gave us a starting point, if you like, and we've read and watched almost everything there is. The saying goes, if you've met one person with Aspergers or on the autistic spectrum, you've just met one person, and that is absolutely the case. The diagnosis opened up opportunities that perhaps we weren't previously aware of. So, for example, obtaining an education healthcare plan and what that enables him as an individual and as a student to achieve. Opens up opportunities to engage with other families and share and help other families who are going through a new diagnosis.
I would say as a parent, you're the best professional, the most well-informed person ever when it comes to your child. Don't let professionals tell you who your child is. They can tell you that your child has these symptoms that look like this particular diagnosis or this particular problem, but you know your child, you know the heart of your child, you know the foundation of your child. Advocate for your child and be strong and sure in your opinions. Don't let people take their expertise and make you feel like you are a layman's person, because there's nobody in this world that knows your child like you.